Welcome to Epithets, exploring the sacred titles of Hekate. Hello, everyone. This is your co-hosts, Isaac Fars and Robin Silverman.
Hello.
Robin, say hi.
Hi.
And here we are to talk about this episode's epithet, which is Anassa Eneron, Queen of the Dead. As always, well, first of all, I want to apologize for our little hiatus. We had a bunch of scheduling conflicts and life stuff that just kind of got in the way. Actually, what really happened was the first time we recorded this, it was in person. Both Robin and I were sharing space in one place, and I forgot a microphone. So we tried using one and it didn't cut it. So I just had, I uploaded it really quick, then listened to it and realized half the stuff was missing because of bad tech stuff. So here we are redoing the episode, bringing it back from the dead as best we can, which ties it into, of course, the name and the epithet. Robin, what does Anassa Eneron mean? And I believe that you have a little bit of grammar to talk about when it comes to this as well.
Yes, I'm gonna give a little grammar lesson. Yeah, as Isaac said, we recorded this already a couple weeks ago, so there may be a time when I'm like, well, like I said last time, and if I say that, don't get confused and think that you already heard something or you missed anything, because you didn't. It's just me realizing that we're repeating something. So Anassa Eneron literally means Queen of the Dead. Anassa is the feminine form of the word anax, which means ruler, leader. Though we usually translate it as queen, but I kind of think of it more like lady. It's more like a sort of more less of a sort of political position like you might think of a queen, and more of a kind of symbolic leadership. So for example, like Zeus gets called Zeus Anax, right? Which you could translate as King Zeus, but Lord Zeus, I think, better captures the feeling behind it. So Anassa Eneron, even though I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with translating as Queen of the Dead, I kind of think of it more like Lady of the Dead, or Ruler of the Dead, or something less what's the word, exalted than Queen.
Mhm.
More think of
Less
it more
pomp
like
and
a,
circumstance.
yeah, yeah. But still, still an authority. But
Mhm.
yes, so Anassa is the feminine form of the word anax, which is, the chief, the boss, the leader. And Eneron is of the dead. And actually not quite of the dead. Again, it's another one. We translate it as of the dead, but really it means of the ones below, the ones underground, the ones under the earth. And what's meant by that is the dead, but literally it means the ones underground. And where that grammar lesson comes in is that I noticed looking around, we see some different forms of this. And that happens because Greek is a language that uses cases for the nouns. And what that means is that Greek nouns will take an ending. They'll take a form, a particular ending to the noun, which indicates what they're doing in the sentence. So we see Anassa Eneron, that's two words, right? Anassa means the queen. Eneron is of the ones underground, and it's of the ones underground because of that on ending, Anassa Eneron. But we see this in other forms in like the Argonautica. There's a line in there that goes Brimo Nuktapolon Chthonion Eneroisen Anassan. And that Eneroisen Anassan is also means it's also Anassa Eneron, right? But it's in a different grammatical form. And so I'm just going to do a quick breakdown of Greek cases. And an episode we recorded before this, the one everybody actually heard, Isaac had actually had a grammar question that I kind of dismissed. I was kind of like, you don't need to know that. It doesn't matter, because he was specifically about case endings. And I was just like, it's case ending. Don't worry about it. You don't need to know. And for a lot of these epithets, you really don't. Most of them are in the vocative or nominative case, which is the case you use for the subject, or the vocative case is for address. But I dismissed it, and I kind of felt bad for dismissing it because it's not irrelevant. It's a little bit more information that people need to know. But then this epithet pops up, and you do kind of need to know. So I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of Greek case endings, of Greek cases. You have the nominative, which is used for the subject of the verb. You have the genitive, which is used for possession, origin, separation, anything where you could say the X of Y, right? So in this case, queen of the dead, because Eneron is in the genitive case. It's plural genitive. We have the dative, which is for an indirect object or locative relationships, things like to or for, right? If you're going to the store would be the dative. The accusative is the direct object of the verb. And then the vocative is the direct address. And all of these take different endings. And there are a whole bunch of different Greek cases, so it's not consistent. It's not like you can say, oh, it has this ending, it means it's always this, because different nouns have different, it's complicated. But the short version is that if you see these different endings, it tells you different things that it's doing. So Anassa Eneron is queen of the dead. This Eneroisen Anassan that we see in the Argonautica, that Eneroisen is actually the plural dative form of Eneros, which would mean that an Anassan is in the accusative because of where it is in the sentence. But so putting it in the dative means that it means something more like queen among the dead, or the queen who is, with the dead, rather than queen of the dead. So I just thought that was a really interesting little shift, because I was looking for Anassa Eneron in the literature, and it's there, but then we also get this other variety that puts it in this other case, which makes it slightly different, right? She's not queen of the dead. She's queen. She's the queen who happens to be around the dead, basically the queen who hangs out with the dead. She's a queen and she's near the dead, but she's not necessarily queen of the dead. And then there's another form, which I noticed online, like people using in their blogs and such, that was Anassa Eneroi. And frankly, I can't quite make head nor tails of that, because Eneroi would be the plural nominative. And Anassa's in the nominative as well. So we have two nominatives together. Usually that's an adjective. So Anassa Eneroi would mean something like the dead queen. But since Eneroi is plural, it kind of falls apart and it doesn't quite make sense. So I don't know where that Anassa Eneroi came from. I think my suspicion is that somebody used it at some point, and it sounds pretty good if you don't know Greek. And then it just sort of gets passed around like things do on the internet. I could be wrong. I'm always open to being wrong. If somebody has an ancient attestation for this and some kind of explanation of what it means, I'd love to hear it. But I think Anassa Eneroi is just straight up not correct. It's Anassa Eneron, or Anassa Eneroisen, not Anassa Eneroi. But we use Anassa Eneron because that's the one that kind of makes the most sense in this context. Queen of the dead, queen of the ones underground. And I hope that little tour through Greek grammar made sense. It wasn't too all over the place, but I do feel like it actually applies with this epithet.
So if you know of why people use Eneroi, let us know. You can email us or catch us up on social media. But, I'll talk about that at the end of the episode, as if you haven't listened to all the other episodes. But anyway, yeah, that's it's always interesting to see how how we change things accidentally when we don't necessarily know where it comes from. Like there's this weird game of telephone that can happen, and we can change things that aren't, especially when things aren't in our language, like Anassa Eneron.
Yeah.
So how she got this title of the dead, there's some obvious things, which I'm going to point out. One, we've talked about Enneadia and her conflation, Hekate's conflation with Enneadia, and Enneadia had our connection to the dead. So that's probably one of the big places it may have originally come from when they combined those two deities. Also, if you look at the Persephone myth, Hecate is the one that is bringing Persephone down to Hades and bringing her back. That links her to the dead that way, being one of the few deities that go in between and is comfortable hanging out in the underworld with the dead. There is also her grandmother, Gaia, that kind of more ties into Chthonian, but Gaia still is the place where we, lay bodies to rest. So we could be looking at it in that way. The Enneadia bit is really, really the big thing in my mind. She is mentioned as a deity of the dead in Lucian's or Lucian. Do you know how that's pronounced? The Lucian, if
I'd
it's
say that
ancient Greek.
I'd say that Lucian.
It's solution. Okay.
Yeah, I would still say it Lucian.
I get confused with like, which ones get how grammar works sometimes with some of these guys. But Lucian of Samosata wrote this book, Dialogues of the Dead, and in it, the character, let's see, the has a character that is learning necromancy and is told to reference Hekate and his magic, to connect to the dead, to raise the dead, and how's all this stuff about working with her, and that is from uh sometime mid first century or so, or second century, sorry. Lucian lived to about 120 to 190 CE. So that is another place where we can look at historically that the bit of her being a deity of the dead comes into play. And we can look at later stuff. There's a bunch of later stuff that she's referred to. And in my research, I had found a coin showing her. I'd have to look it up now. I was mentioning to Robin the notes that I made for this episode when we did it originally kind of got torn up a little bit, so I'm working with half notes. But I remember reading in Circles for Hecate from Sarita d'Este that there is they're showing an old world coin with Hecate pouring wine out to the dead. Another callback to her relating to the dead. Also, in my own practice and in my own way of viewing her, being the one who is compassionate to the lost dead, that really ties into it. A lot of the magic that I'm used to working with when it comes to Hecate is still kind of dead related, even though it's if it's not necessarily the dead, but the idea of not only guiding the lost dead home, but you kind of utilizing the restless dead that's looking for something to do, kind of, the restless dead, instead of wreaking havoc, instead they can do magical work for her or for people who are working with her and making offerings to her. Robin, I know you had some stuff.
Oh, sure. I'm actually going to jump way further back in time. I'm going to go
Yes.
all the way back to Odysseus, who
Okay.
very famously spoke with the dead in an episode from the Odyssey. And the thing that feels relevant to what we're talking about is the fact that Odysseus needed to talk to a dead person to get some information, and the one who told him how to do that was Circe. And as we've talked about in other contexts, Circe and Hecate have a lot of associations in some versions. I think Circe is Hecate's daughter. But in any case, Circe is one of these sort of prototypical witches. And so the fact that Odysseus went to a witch to learn how to talk to the dead takes it right on back. And then, like, by about the 5th century BC, Euripides talks about in the play Helen. Euripides talks about Hecate as the sender of ghosts, the one who sends the ghosts forth. So, like, in the Homeric times, in the times of the Odyssey, Odysseus had to work really, really hard. Like, his thing that he had to do to get in touch with the dead was pretty complicated. But like by the 5th century, by the time of Euripides, you kind of couldn't avoid the dead. You had to be really careful about like how you buried the dead. You had to make sure they had the correct offerings. You had to, you had to really make sure that the dead were laid to rest properly so they didn't bother you. If things were going on in your life that, you were having nightmares, you were having a lot of bad luck, you were having, you were feeling what we might think of as crossed, the first thing you would do would be to make offerings to the dead. So by this point, there was this definite sense that the dead could and would interfere with the living, especially if they weren't properly laid to rest. And that was something that was very much associated with Hekate by that time. That the dead, there were two actually kind of relevant words for this, and one is the Aoroi, which are associated with Hekate, and the Aoroi are the ones who died before their time, the ones who they're sometimes just thought of as the restless dead, but they're the ones who don't accept being dead. And then there's the Ataphoi, who are the dead who have not been given the correct funeral rites, who also cannot rest. So there's these categories of restless dead. There's also the idea of, the unmarried woman who dies as a restless spirit. We sometimes see with the
Oh
yeah,
no, she didn't
because
get
she's
married.
unfulfilled, right? So
Oh,
an
yeah.
unmarried woman who dies, it can be considered the restless dead. And we actually have with the curse tablets, which I'm going to come to in just a minute, the idea of
Oh yeah.
finding the grave of an unmarried woman in order to connect with these restless dead, in order to get in order as a sort of conduit to Hekate. You would go to a grave of somebody who died untimely in some way, and one of the categories of that was an unmarried woman. We see it actually in a couple of the curse tablets. I think we see it in terms of like love magic, like as you died unmarried, let this person also be unmarried, when they wanted to mess with somebody's relationship. So there were this idea of the restless dead, the dead who had not been properly laid to rest, as sort of being specific to Hekate. Hekate, like, as you say, she's the one who is compassionate to them. She's the one who kind of gathers them up, and they follow her. And yeah, this was as early as the 5th century BC. So this has been going on a long time. And then I do want to bring in the curse tablets, because the curse tablets are just fascinating and horrifying. I have this really great book by John Gager called Curse Tablets and Binding Spells of the Ancient World, which is basically a
Uplifting.
catalog of curse tablets. It's a wonderful and horrifying book, and if you're interested in all this sort of thing, it's worth hunting down. But what a curse tablet was, just to explain, is a sort of very common and basic sort of folk magic would be you get like a lead tablet, and you would inscribe your curse on the tablet, and then you would deposit it in a well or a grave, or sometimes a river. They would find deposits of these things like in sacred springs or whatever, or in graves, as a kind of letter to the underworld. The dead, Hecate, Hermes, Persephone were often addressed in these as a way of contacting the dead through these underworld gods, in order to get something done, get somebody cursed. And I just wanted to read the text of some of these, because they're really interesting, they're really cool, and they're very, and like I've got one here bookmarked that's very Hecate specific. This one was found in a well, I think. Yes, in a well. And this one's really cool because it has like a drawing on it, which I hope maybe I can have Isaac post this drawing, because it's just this sort of crude line drawing of, and it's of Hecate. It's this figure with like 6 arms carrying torches. So this is drawing, and then I'm going to read the text now that's on the tablet. And this is a curse on a thief. I make an exception for the writer and the destroyer, because he does this unwillingly, forced into it by the thieves. I register and hand over to Pluto, and to the Fates, and to Persephone, and to the Furies, and every harmful being. I hand them over to Hecate, eater of what has been demanded by the gods. I hand over to the goddesses and gods of the underworld, and to Hermes the helper. I transferred the thieves who stole from the little house in the quarter called Akalou, who stole chain, 3 spreads, 1 woolen, white, new, gum arabic, tools, white piles of dirt, linseed oil, and 3 white objects, mastic, pepper, and bitter almonds. I hand over those who know about the theft and deny it. I hand over all of those who have received what is contained in this deposition. Lady Hekate of the heavens, Hekate of the underworld, Hekate of the crossroads, Hekate of the triple face, Hekate of the single face, cut out the hearts of the thieves or the thief who took the items contained in this deposition. And let the earth not be walkable, the sea not sailable. Let there be no enjoyment of life, no increase of children, but may utter destruction visit them or him. As inspector, you will wield upon them the bronze sickle, and you will cut them out. But I exempt the writer and the destroyer. So this is a pretty serious curse on the thief of bitter almonds and mastic and chains and whatever else.
Don't mess with somebody's mastic.
Yeah. and there's nothing in there about like getting the stuff back. They just want the thief punished, and they want them punished hard. But the specific call to Hecate there, I kind of love that in that one. And depositing this in a well, right? So it goes down below, down to the underworld. So it's almost like a letter to the underworld, right? Saying, here, do this thing for me. And Hecate would get called on these things all the time on these curse tablets. You see her name pop up, along with Persephone and Chthoni and Hermes, and sometimes Pluto or Hades. But yeah, this was a very, and then there's tons of these things. I mean, and that's just what we found. I mean, who knows how many of these people had around, and for all kinds of different situations. Things to cause someone to break up with their partner or to fall in love with them, usually in really horrifying ways. The love spells are just awful.
Right. I think we've kind of covered that. If you have to do these kind of love spells, you're not going to be a good boyfriend. You have issues.
Yes.
It's like try therapy instead.
Or girlfriend. It
Yeah,
goes both ways. There women did these too.
That's true.
Yeah.
Either way, instead of cursing, try therapy. I don't know.
Right. Right. But yeah, the love spells they really are curses. Even though, it's like, make her not be able to eat or sleep or breathe until she comes to me, that kind of thing. Just like torture her in every way until she shows up at my door.
Such an insult thing.
Yeah. Yes. They're awful, but again, they're fascinating too, and for anyone who's interested to see how regular people, the people who do this wouldn't necessarily be like super educated magical practitioners. These are people who just this is folk magic, and just how common that was. But yeah, this idea that if you want to get stuff done, you go through Hecate to talk to the dead.
Yeah. Do you have restless ghosts in your life? Are they really angry? Have you tried getting them in on a curse? I mean, that's kind of what. It's interesting. You had mentioned also rivers. I remember people talking about the idea of using rivers. Rivers being kind of rivers anger as a way for being kind of cursy. So it's interesting that connection to water and that connection to the underworld.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's curse tablets. I will try to put up that image. You had sent that to me earlier, and I was going to
send it
try
again if you want, but it's just neat.
I think I can dig it up. So I just distractions. But yeah, working with the dead in magic is a very old tradition, and kind of getting ghosts to do things for you is very, very classic. I mean, even outside of Ghosts and the Restless Dead, even Ancestors, which Anassa Eneron may have not necessarily covered classically, but nowadays when I work with her under that epithet, That totally covers ancestors,
Yeah.
because they're still the ancestors. They're not, hopefully not the restless dead, but they're the dead that have a stake in my well-being if they want their line to continue. I don't remember if we talked about ancestors in other episodes or if we talked about them in the episode that we had a scrap.
I think we talked about it in the scrapped episode, but I'm not sure we've said much about it in the other episodes.
Oh,
Maybe in
this
the
is a
energy
really good.
episode, but yeah, getting into the ancestors because I've talked about the sort of very dark side of working with the dead, but the fact is the ancestors are the whole reason to work with the dead really is that they're the closest to us of the
Yeah.
spirits, right? Of those, you know, on the other side of those who don't have bodies of that
Mm,
category of being. They're the ones who are the closest to us. They're the ones who know what we're going through. They're the ones who
right.
understand what it's like to live a human life. And so they understand the kinds of things that concern us. I think that, the sort of the gods and the earth spirits and these sort of beings that are sort of further away from humanity, if we start talking about, not being able to pay the rent, they won't know what we're talking about, or they won't understand why it's a big deal, but an ancestor will, an
Right.
ancestor, or even, even your local dead who aren't necessarily in your bloodline, they are more likely to understand why and to have compassion for the more everyday concerns of living.
Hmm. Well, before I had kind of covered my historical stuff. Everything else that I had is kind of more of a stretch, and this is more interesting. Did you have anything else, at least ancient Hekate wise, you wanted to cover before we move on to talking about more how to work with Anassa
Yeah,
Eneron in a
let's move on
let's
to
do the
talking about that.
transition.
Yeah, let's
I
do the
love it.
transition.
Yeah, because it is working with both the ancestors and maybe even bringing ancestral healing. You had mentioned compassion, right? That the compassion of the ancestors because they know what we've been through and they care about what we're going through. We're carrying we are their lineage. We are what's carrying their blood forward. And so they, in theory, kind of want that to continue to happen. Um, but Hekate, when she comes in with this compassion for the dead and for the lost dead, there's also you could call on her and work with her in an ancestral working kind of way. If you have ancestral baggage from the dead that needs some healing and clearing, that might be a really helpful epithet to call on in that work if you're trying to reach in and do that kind of ancestral healing. Also, if you're working with graveyards, so say you're working with spirits of the dead, we had talked a little bit that last episode about how you're close to some big, big heavy hitters for the history of the US,
Yeah.
where you are in Philly. And if you wanted to work with that dead, they're there. You could, um, for various things involving politics or the country, I guess, or I mean, something smaller perhaps. But of course, being respectful, leaving offerings for the dead, leaving that, talking to them, leaving the traditional, you know, something, usually, a drink or coins or something for any dirt that you're taking to work with that grave. But Anassa Eneron would be a wonderful epithet to call on in that work as well to help guide you and help kind of help introduce you to your local dead that you need to work with or you want to work with. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of going off about the dead and magic. Uh, what do you think? What do you got for ideas with
Well,
Anassa Eneron, the dead
as
or
you mentioned,
magic?
I live in Philadelphia, which is I would say a very haunted city. Um, we have, you know, it's one of the older, um, I say older, and of course that's not really correct because there's been human habitation on this continent for, much, much longer than my own ancestors have been here. But as far as my own European ancestors. Philadelphia is one of the older settlements in North America. And so we do have some mighty dead here, and we do have layers and layers and layers of history all on top of it, on top of each other. And so, for instance, I actually live very close to a park that at one time was kind of a potter's field. And it's also the location of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for the Revolutionary War. There's a memorial there, and an eternal flame, and in fact a vault with, I assume, a soldier in it from the Revolution. So that park, it's a public park. It's a very pleasant public park. People hang out, walk their dogs there, and chase pigeons, and it's a really nice park. But it's also really, really heavily haunted. It's one of the places, if you do a ghost tour of Philadelphia, your tour guide will take you to Washington Square Park, because it is very haunted. It's the place where everybody sees ghosts. You can't walk through that place at night and not feel it. And being so close to a spot where the dead are so active, it's definitely one of my power spots. I often leave offerings there, very discreet biodegradable offerings, but because it is a public park. But I leave offerings there. I leave offerings for the unknown soldier, and for the people in the cemetery that most of them are still there. Even though there's a park on top of it. We actually had in Philly, there was a major yellow fever epidemic in the 18th century, and piles and piles and piles of bodies, unfortunately, were buried there. And there's also a cemetery a little further up at the Quaker church, a little further up from there, which is also a cemetery for the yellow fever epidemic. And they too really appreciate offerings, because a lot of these were people who were buried. They were atafoy, they were buried without rites, because the plague was really horrifying. It's one of those things that people don't really talk about in American history, because there's so many more dramatic things in American history, but that plague, 1 in 10 people in the city died. It was a major trauma. And so leaving offerings for those dead, for compassion for those dead, and for because a lot of them are still hanging around. So leaving offerings for them also opens up to working with them and allying with them, and being allied with your local dead, whether they're your direct blood ancestors or not, is something I think anyone who does magic really needs to at least have some acquaintance with. Because if you're working with spirits, you're working with gods, those spirits of the dead are going to be hanging around too. And being on good terms with them is nothing but helpful.
Yeah. And I talking about kind of restless dead, or even Ataf, or even the idea of dead wanting to move on. Sometimes the dead is just kind of like, I don't know where to go. Anassa Eneron is another wonderful name, and that's another way to work with that name. Just kind of like, all right, I need help in kind of moving this person on. I do house clearing work, and a lot of times when I do house clearing work, it's just kind of like a miasma of energy, or really just there's rarely a serious thing, and when it's a serious thing, a lot of times it's not very human. But when it is human, that is a useful name to call on. Just to be like, all right, you need help, and I got somebody in my Rolodex who will be useful in this process. That'll be better at than I am. So Anassa Eneron, calling on her. You know what I didn't mention on talking about historical things? The obvious, the Orphic hymns, listing her as a queen of the dead, and or dancing with the souls of the dead, rather. I don't have a copy on me right now. I can't quite quote it, but tangent. I just want to throw that in. But yeah, just generally working, either moving the dead on or calling the dead to do something for you, or working with specific dead and seeing how that goes. These are all really lovely ways to work with Anassa Eneron.
And also, I think another thing I think is, you were mentioning, house clearing, but even a house that does not necessarily need clearing, knowing the history of your house, knowing the people who may not, you don't even necessarily know their names, but having a sense for who lived there before you. Because even, people who are buried elsewhere, if they're still feel really connected to place, could still be hanging around, and having some awareness of them and some understanding of who they might have been. It's one thing I know I do in my kind of regular practice. I'll call on Anassa Eneron and just make a little offering to whoever's hanging around, whoever's hanging around the house, because no matter what, even if they're not causing trouble, even if they're, even if they're totally mellow, if you live, especially if you live in an older house, they're there.
Yeah.
And just, acknowledging them and making a little offering to them can go a long way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, perfect. So next episode, we are going to be tackling something that is going to be a little tricky, but we're up for a challenge. It is a request that we had from somebody. We're going to tackle the secret names of Hekate, Actio Fis Reshkagal Nabat Soaleth. And we're going to get a little bit of bring it a little bit of history, or as much as we can, because 2 out of 3 is it's tricky. One, there's an easy one in there that we're just like, oh yeah, that'll be an easy. But that is mentioned a whole lot in the PGM, and we're gonna tackle it. So get excited. It's gonna be good.
Yeah, get our
But
PGM on with that one.
heck yeah. Well, PGM plus. It'll be interesting where we go with it.
Yeah.
But
for sure.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. If you want to get a hold of us, of course, we are on Instagram, Facebook, and we can be. You can catch us there. You can listen to us on YouTube Music and Spotify. But if you're listening right now, you already know that. So I'm gonna just stop. We look forward to talking to you again next episode. Until then, thanks for listening.